The signal came from the edge of nowhere. It burst out of the ashfall expanse on every frequency the galactic Concorde used, and a few frequencies that nobody had used in centuries. It was messy, it was desperate, it repeated itself over and over again, the way a drowning person screams for air, not caring who hears, not caring how they sound, just needing someone, anyone, to listen. The signal came from Tyra 4, a cold and lonely moon that orbited a gas giant in a system most species had forgotten existed. The moon was small, it was dark. It had deep oceans beneath a crust of ancient ice, and the only reason anyone lived there at all was because of the ruins. The Valith had built a colony on Tyra 411 cycles ago. They were a quiet species, the Valith. They came from a water world far away, a gentle place with slow currents and soft light. Their bodies were thin and delicate, built for floating, not fighting. Their skin glowed with bioluminescence, shifting colors to express emotions the way other species use facial expressions or words. When a Valith was happy, they shimmered blue and gold. When they were afraid, their light dimmed to almost nothing. Right now, every Valith on Tyra 4 was dark. Colony Master Ayalith stood in the command center of the research station and watched the data scrolling across her display. Her hands trembled. Her glow had gone out completely, and the officers around her were the same. 11,000 souls lived on this moon. Researchers, engineers, teachers, families. And in the lower levels of the colony, 3,000 Valith larvae floated in their nursery pools, and were too young to know what was happening, too fragile to be moved. The larvae were the problem, or rather the larvae were the reason that Ealith could not simply load everyone onto transports and run. Valith young were born in water. They breathed through gill membranes that could not handle the pressure changes of emergency faster than light travel. A standard FTL jump would kill them all, every single one. To evacuate the larvae safely, they needed specialized biotransport ships with pressure-controlled aquatic chambers, and the nearest such ships were weeks away. They did not have weeks. "Show me the projection again," Ealith said. Her voice was barely a whisper. Her chief astronomer, a young male named Rothan, pulled up the sensor data with shaking hands. The holographic display filled the center of the room, and every officer turned to look at it even though they had already seen it a dozen times. The Harrow Swarm. It appeared on the display as a cloud of red dots so dense that it looked like a bloodstain spreading across the stars. Billions of individual signatures. Bioships, each one a living organism bred for one purpose: consumption. They moved together like a school of predatory fish, coordinated by hive vessels the size of small moons that pulsed with a cold and alien intelligence. The Harrow Swarm had not been seen in 800 galactic cycles. Most younger species thought they were a myth, a scary story told to frighten children. But the Valith were old enough to remember. Their historical archives held records of what the Harrow did to worlds that stood in their path. They did not conquer. They did not negotiate. They fed. And they stripped planets down to bare rock, consuming everything organic. Plants, animals, people, soil, water, atmosphere. When the Harrow finished with a world, there was nothing left but a dead stone spinning in the dark, and their trajectory put them directly on a collision course with Tyra 4. 6 rotations, Rothan said quietly. Maybe less. Their acceleration is increasing. 6 rotations. 6 days in the common galactic calendar. 6 days before the swarm reached the system and consumed everything in it. Eilith closed her eyes. The light under her skin flickered once, a pale, grief-stricken violet, and then went dark again. "Send the signal," she said. "Send it on everything. Every frequency, every relay, every channel we have access to. Send it to the Concord. Send it to everyone." Rothan hesitated. "Colony Master, the Concord has protocols for this. They will convene a session. They will debate. They will—" "I know what they will do," Ealith said. "Send it anyway. And Rothan, make it loud." He did. The signal raced outward at the speed of light, amplified by every relay station it touched, bouncing from system to system across the vast web of communication networks that connected the Galactic Concord's 4,000 member species. It carried the Valith colony's identification codes, its coordinates, its population count, and a simple, raw, unformatted message that needed no translation. Harrow swarm detected. Trajectory confirmed. Impact in 6 rotations. 11,000 civilians. 3,000 larvae. Unable to evacuate. We cannot run. Please help us. The message hit the Concord Senate like a stone dropped into still water. The Senate chamber on Valros Prime was the largest enclosed structure in the known galaxy. It was a cathedral of diplomacy, a vast sphere of tiered seating where representatives of thousands of species sat in atmosphere-controlled pods, each one tailored to their biology. The chamber could hold 50,000 delegates. When the emergency session was called, it filled within the hour. Speaker Tarun, a massive, slow-moving being who resembled a living mountain of gray stone, called the session to order. His voice rumbled through the chamber like distant thunder. The Valith colony on Tyra 4 has issued a distress call. The nature of the threat is confirmed. A Harrow swarm of unprecedented scale is 6 rotations from the system. The colony cannot evacuate its young. They are requesting military intervention. The chamber erupted. Not with offers of help, with fear. The Rilshari delegate, a creature of flowing silver and sharp angles, spoke first. The Harrow swarm has not been successfully engaged in combat by any known fleet in recorded history. Sending ships to Tyra 4 would be sending them to their destruction. The Rilshari cannot support this. The Torvan delegate, wrapped in ceremonial robes of deep red, agreed. The Torvan Dominion extends its deepest sympathies to the Valith people. However, our fleets are needed to protect our own systems in the event the swarm changes course. We cannot spare them. One by one they spoke. The Drelkath, the Osseran, the Pallavi, the Geneth. Species with vast fleets, species with advanced weapons, species that had signed treaties promising mutual defense. And every single one of them said the same thing in different words. We are sorry, but we will not come. Some were honest about their fear. Others hid behind protocol and procedure. A few delegates quietly left the chamber, unable to face what was happening. The Morthani representative gave a long, eloquent speech about the tragedy of the situation that used beautiful language and offered absolutely nothing. In her pod, the Valith ambassador listened to all of it. Her name was Siluri, and she was old. Old enough to remember when the Valith first joined the Concord, full of hope and trust. Old enough to remember every promise that had been made, every treaty signed, every handshake and ceremony and grand declaration of unity and mutual protection. She sat very still as species after species explained why they could not help, and her bioluminescence cycled through colors that her aides had never seen before. Deep purples, burning reds, and a strange, terrible black that pulsed at the edges of her skin like bruises forming in real time. When the last delegate finished speaking, Siluri stood. She walked to the central podium. She moved slowly because she was old and because her body was not built for the heavy gravity of the Senate chamber. It took her a long time to reach the podium, and the entire chamber watched in silence as she walked. When she reached the podium, she placed her thin hands on its surface. She looked out at the thousands of faces watching her, and then her light went out. Not dimmed, not flickered. It went completely dark, every trace of bioluminescence extinguished. And in Valith culture, this was the most devastating expression possible. It was the light of grief so deep that the body could no longer express it. It was the death of hope. And then she wept. Valith did not cry with tears. They wept with light. The bioluminescence returned, but wrong. Flickering, fractured, broken patterns that strobed and shattered across her skin like a signal from a dying star. It was ugly. It was raw. It was the most naked display of pain that most delegates had ever witnessed. My people are going to die, Siluri said. Her voice cracked. Our children are going to die, and you are all going to sit here and watch. She did not say anything else. She stood there weeping light, and the Senate chamber was so quiet that you could hear the atmospheric processors humming in the walls. In the upper gallery, far above the Senate floor, where the human delegation watched, there were 4 of them. They sat in a small observation pod that most species forgot existed, because humanity was still relatively new to the Concord. Barely 40 cycles since first contact. and they had not yet earned the political weight that came with centuries of membership. They were tolerated, respected from a distance, and quietly feared. Ambassador Kira Ose sat in the center of the pod. She was a tall woman with dark skin and close-cropped silver hair, and she wore a simple black suit that looked deliberately unremarkable in a chamber full of ceremonial costumes. She had been watching the session with a still, unreadable expression. Her hands were folded in her lap. She had not moved in over an hour. Beside her, her aide, a young man named David Chen, leaned over and whispered, "They're not going to do anything, are they?" Kira did not answer immediately. She watched Siluri standing alone at the podium, her broken light flickering across the faces of 4,000 species who had chosen to look away. Kira's jaw tightened. Something shifted behind her eyes. Something hard and old and very, very human. "No," Kira said quietly. "They're not." She stood up. She did not make a speech. She did not address the Senate. She simply turned and walked out of the gallery, and her team followed without a word. In the corridor outside the chamber, Kira pulled out a secure communication device. It was military grade, encrypted on frequencies that the Concorde could not intercept. She typed a message, short, precise, using a code that had not been activated in 9 years. Black Wake, Tyra 4, 6 rotations. Civilians in the path. She sent it. The message traveled through a chain of relay stations that humanity had quietly placed throughout the galaxy over the past 4 decades. It bounced from relay to relay, each one hidden inside asteroids and dead moons, until it reached a communications array orbiting Earth's moon. From there, it went to one person. Admiral Renko Vasquez sat in the command center of Orbital Station Prometheus, Earth's primary military coordination hub. It was a massive facility that hung in geosynchronous orbit above the Pacific Ocean, and from its observation deck, you could see the blue curve of the planet below, wrapped in white clouds. Vasquez was 57 years old, built like a piece of industrial machinery, and Owen had a face that looked like it had been carved from rough stone by someone who did not believe in gentle curves. He was drinking coffee when the message arrived. He set the cup down, read it twice, and was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then he turned to his aide, Commander Torres, and said 5 words. "Wake the 2nd and 7th. Torres did not ask questions. She did not ask for clarification or confirmation. She had served under Vasquez for 12 years, and she knew that tone of voice. It was the tone that meant people were in trouble, and there was no time for talking. She picked up a secure line and began making calls. Within 30 minutes, alarms were sounding across 6 military installations on 3 continents and 4 orbital stations. Crews scrambled, engines ignited. How supply chains activated with a speed that would have seemed impossible to any species that did not understand what humanity was capable of when someone needed help. The Second Fleet was stationed in the Kepler sector, 72 light-years from Earth. 140 warships. Battle cruisers, destroyers, carriers, support vessels, and marine transports. Its commanding officer, Vice Admiral Hanna Morozov, received her orders while running on a treadmill. She read them, stepped off the treadmill, and was on her bridge in 11 minutes. The 7th Fleet was smaller but faster, a rapid response force designed to hit hard and arrive without warning. 60 ships, all of them armed to the teeth. Its commander, Rear Admiral James Okafor, received his orders while eating dinner with his family. He kissed his daughter on the forehead, told his husband he would be home soon, and was in orbit within the hour. Across the galaxy, hyperspace corridors that had been dormant for years suddenly blazed with energy. Transit signatures lit up on sensor arrays from one end of conquered space to the other. The signatures were massive, they were moving fast, and they were all heading in the same direction. On Valros Prime, the Concorde's long-range sensor operators noticed first. One of them, a Drocath analyst with 6 eyes and a talent for pattern recognition, stared at the data streaming across her console and felt something she had never felt before in her professional career. "Sir," she said to her supervisor. Her voice was strange. "Sir, I'm reading massive hyperspace transit signatures, multiple fleet-scale formations. They're converging on a single vector." "Which vector?" "Tyra 4. Her supervisor leaned over her shoulder and looked at the data. His face changed. He reached for a communication panel and opened a channel to the Senate floor. Attention, Senate Chamber. This is Central Sensor Command. We are detecting large-scale military fleet movements heading toward the Tyra 4 system. The transit signatures match known profiles. A pause. A long electric pause that seemed to stretch across the entire galaxy. The signatures are human. The Senate chamber, which had been buzzing with low conversation and quiet shame, went absolutely silent. 4,000 species, 50,000 delegates, all staring at nothing, trying to process what they had just heard. At the central podium, Siluri lifted her head. Her broken light steadied, just slightly, on into something fragile and disbelieving. In the Concord's intelligence division, senior analysts scrambled to verify the data. They pulled up everything they had on human military capabilities, which was not as much as they wanted because humans were frustratingly private about their fleets. What they found made several of them sit down very suddenly. 200 ships, one analyst murmured. They've mobilized 200 ships in less than a day. That's not possible, his colleague said. No species can mobilize that fast. Humans can. Another analyst, older and quieter than the rest, looked at the trajectory data and performed a calculation that no one had asked him to do. He calculated the fleet's arrival time at Tyra 4, compared it to the swarm's arrival time, and stared at the result. Wayna, they'll arrive with 2 rotations to spare, he said to no one in particular. They're going to beat the swarm there. A young sensor technician at the back of the room whispered something that would later become one of the most quoted phrases in galactic history. She did not know anyone was listening. She was not trying to be profound. She was simply staring at her screen, watching 200 warships burn across the galaxy toward a moon full of strangers, and the words fell out of her mouth before she could stop them. The Deathworlders are coming. The Senate heard it. The news networks heard it. Within hours, the entire galaxy heard it. On Tyra 4, Eolith received a notification that human fleets were inbound. She read it 3 times. Then she walked to the nursery levels, where 3,000 larvae floated in warm, dark pools, and their tiny bodies pulsing with faint, innocent light. She stood at the edge of the nearest pool and watched them drift, and for the first time since the swarm had been detected, she allowed herself to glow. It was small, it was fragile, but it was there. Someone was coming. Across the galaxy, in Senate chambers and military posts, in civilian homes on 1,000 worlds, beings of every shape and size turned to each other and asked the same question. Why? Why would the Deathworlders, the most feared species in the galaxy, the creatures from a world so hostile that it should have killed them 1,000 times over? Why would they send their fleets to die for a species they barely knew? What did they gain? What was the strategy? What was the angle? They did not understand. They would not understand for a long time. But on the bridge of the UNSC Thermopylae, flagship of the Second Fleet, as the stars stretched into white lines and the ship plunged into hyperspace, Admiral Renko Vasquez stood with his hands clasped behind his back and looked at the star chart showing their destination. The blue dot of Tyra 4 pulsed gently on the display. He thought about 11,000 people who were afraid. He thought about 3,000 children who could not run. He thought about an old woman weeping light on a Senate floor while the galaxy watched and did nothing. And he said quietly to the empty bridge, "Not on my watch." The fleet burned onward. The galaxy held its breath. And on a small, cold moon at the edge of nowhere, 11,000 souls waited in the dark, hoping that the signal they had sent into the void would not be ignored. It wasn't. At the UNSC Thermopylae was not a beautiful ship. No one who looked at it would call it elegant or graceful. It was a battle cruiser in the truest sense of the word. 2 kilometers of armored hull, layered weapons platforms, and engines powerful enough to push a small moon out of orbit. It looked like it had been built by people who expected to be hit very hard and wanted to make sure they could hit back harder, which was exactly what had happened. Admiral Renko Vasquez stood on the bridge and watched hyperspace stream past the forward viewports. The light of compressed space-time turned everything a pale electric blue. It was beautiful in a way that most humans found unsettling, like staring into the eye of a hurricane and recognizing that the calm was temporary. The bridge crew worked around him in controlled silence. 30 officers at their stations, running calculations, monitoring fleet formation, checking weapon systems. Nobody spoke unless they had something worth saying. This was the Second Fleet, and the Second Fleet did not waste words. "Admiral," Commander Torres said from her station, "fleet formation confirmed. All 140 ships are in hyperspace corridor alignment. The Seventh Fleet reports they will be 32 hours behind us. Rear Admiral Okafor says, and I'm quoting directly, 'Try to leave some for us.'" Vasquez allowed himself the ghost of a smile. "Tell James he can have whatever's left. The hospital ship Florence reports all medical bays are prepped. They've loaded additional supplies for aquatic biology. Apparently the medical staff has been studying Valith physiology since we departed. No, they say they're ready." "They studied an alien species biology in 9 hours? The chief medical officer hasn't slept, sir. Neither has most of her staff." Vasquez nodded. That sounded about right. He turned from the viewport and walked to the central command table. A large holographic display that showed the fleet's current position, their destination, and, in angry red, the projected path of the Harrow swarm. The two trajectories converged at Tyra 4, like the paths of two bullets aimed at the same target. "Time to arrival?" Vasquez asked. 18 hours, sir. We will arrive approximately 2 rotations before the swarm." "Good. That gives us time to set up. Send a message to all captains. I want a full briefing in 6 hours. And Torres?" "Sir?" "Find out everything we know about the Harrow swarm. Everything. I want their composition, their attack patterns, their biology, their weaknesses. If someone wrote a paper about them 300 years ago, I want it on my desk." Torres nodded and began working. Vasquez stood at the command table and looked at the small blue dot that was Tyra 4, and he thought about the 11,000 people waiting there. Across the galaxy, in places far from the Thermopylae Bridge, other people were thinking about other things. In the Concord's intelligence headquarters on Velros Prime, senior analyst Kareth of the Drellcath species sat at her console and tried to understand what she was looking at. Kareth had 6 eyes, each one capable of perceiving a different spectrum of light, and she used all of them now as she processed the data flowing across her screens. See, she had been assigned to the Human Analysis Division 3 years ago, a posting that most analysts considered either a punishment or a joke. Humans were new. Humans were small, relatively speaking. Humans were from a single unremarkable planet in a quiet corner of the galaxy. How interesting could they possibly be? Very interesting, it turned out. Terrifyingly interesting. Kareth pulled up the fleet data first. 200 warships mobilized in under 12 hours. She had run the numbers 4 times because she was convinced there was an error. There was no error. The Second Fleet had gone from standby to full combat deployment in 9 hours. The Seventh Fleet had been activated 3 hours after that. Supply chains, fuel depots, ammunition reserves, and medical facilities. All of it had come online with a speed that defied every logistical model the Concorde used. For comparison, Kareth pulled up the mobilization times of other Concorde species. The Rilshari, who had one of the most advanced militaries in known space, needed 42 standard rotations to fully mobilize a comparable fleet. The Torvan needed 60. The fastest species in the Concorde, the Geneth, could do it in 20. Humans did it in less than 1. How? Kareth muttered to herself. She had been asking this question a lot lately. She opened the Human Analysis Division's classified files, a collection of data, reports, and intelligence assessments that had been assembled over the 4 decades since first contact. She had read most of it before, but she read it again now with fresh eyes. Because something was about to happen at Tyra 4 that the galaxy had never seen, and she wanted to understand it. The file on Earth came first. Earth was classified as a Class 12 death world. This classification was, in itself, remarkable because the Concorde's planetary danger scale only went to 10. The scale had been in use for 6,000 years, and it had been perfectly adequate for categorizing every inhabited world in the galaxy. Then the Concorde had discovered Earth, and they had to add 2 more numbers. Kareth read the summary again, even though she had memorized it. Earth had an axial tilt that created extreme seasonal variations. It had tectonic plates that shifted and collided, producing earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and tsunamis. Its atmosphere generated storms powerful enough to flatten cities. However, it was home to approximately 8 million species of plants and animals, a staggering number, and roughly 80% of them were either venomous, poisonous, predatory, parasitic, or some combination of all four. The planet's dominant predators included creatures that weighed several tons and could bite through bone. Its oceans contained animals that hunted with electrical fields, dissolved prey with acid, or simply swallowed other animals whole. Even its plants were dangerous. Some produced toxins, some had thorns that could pierce body armor. One species of tree was so poisonous that standing under it in the rain could cause chemical burns. And the humans had evolved on this world. They had not merely survived it, they had conquered it. They had risen to the top of a food chain that was more like a food war, and they had done it without claws, without venom, without natural armor, without any of the biological weapons that other species relied on. They had done it with their brains, their hands, and a characteristic that the Concord xenobiologists had struggled to categorize: persistence, stubbornness, the absolute bone-deep refusal to give up. Kareth scrolled to the section on human biology. She had read it many times, but it still made her uncomfortable. Humans were endurance predators. On their homeworld, before they developed technology, they had hunted by simply following their prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. They could not outrun most animals, but they did not need to. They just kept going. Hour after hour, day after day, in heat that would have killed most galactic species. They simply refused to stop moving until whatever they were chasing fell down and died. Their bodies were built for damage. Their bones healed. Their skin closed over wounds. They could lose blood, significant amounts of blood, and continue functioning. Their immune systems attacked foreign organisms with a ferocity that xenobiologists described as excessive and unnecessary. They could survive temperature ranges that would kill a Valith in minutes. They could go without water for days. They could go without sleep for days, though this made them increasingly unstable, which was somehow even more frightening. And then there was the adrenaline response. When a human perceived danger, their body flooded with chemicals that increased their heart rate, dilated their pupils, suppressed pain, enhanced reaction speed, and redirected blood flow to major muscle groups. In other words, when a human was afraid, their body's response was to become temporarily stronger, faster, and harder to kill. Most galactic species, when afraid, became weaker. Humans became more dangerous. Kareth closed the biology file and opened the military history file. This one was shorter because humans had only been involved in 3 significant military engagements since joining the galactic community, and all 3 had been brief. The first was the Torvan border incident 9 years ago. A Torvan warlord had decided to test humanity's resolve by raiding a human colony on the frontier. He had sent 30 ships. The human response force had arrived in 6 hours and destroyed all 30 ships in 22 minutes. And the warlord had survived and sent a formal apology the next day. The second was the Pahlavi hostage crisis 6 years ago. A Pahlavi terrorist cell had taken 47 human civilians hostage on a space station. Human special forces had boarded the station, killed every terrorist, and extracted every hostage in 11 minutes. 2 of the special forces operators had been shot during the operation. Both of them finished the mission before seeking medical attention. The third was the Rilshari confrontation 4 years ago. A Rilshari fleet had attempted to blockade a neutral trade route that humans used. The human Third Fleet had arrived and positioned itself directly in front of the blockade. No shots were fired. The Rilshari fleet had looked at the human ships, performed some calculations, and left. The entire confrontation lasted 3 hours, and the only communication from the human fleet had been a single message: move. Kareth stared at these files and tried to extract a pattern, a strategy, something she could use to predict what was about to happen at Tyra 4. But the pattern she found was not a military one. It was something else. In the first incident, humans had responded to protect their own people. Expected, normal. Every species did that. In the second incident, humans had responded with overwhelming force to save 47 civilians. Not a strategic target, Not a military installation, 47 ordinary people. In the third incident, humans had risked a war with one of the galaxy's largest powers over a trade route. Not their trade route, a neutral one used by dozens of species. The pattern was not about strategy. It was about principle. Kareth leaned back in her chair and tried to wrap her mind around a species that would mobilize 200 warships in 9 hours to save 11,000 aliens they had never met. She could not do it. She was an analyst. She dealt in logic, in probability, in cost-benefit calculations. And by every calculation she could perform, what the humans were doing made no sense. She wrote a single line in her report: human motivations remain outside predictive models. Aboard the Thermopylae, Admiral Vasquez held his briefing. The captains of the Second Fleet appeared as holographic projections around the conference table. 140 faces, each one commanding a warship, each one ready for what was coming. They were a diverse group, young captains and old ones, the veterans of all 3 prior engagements and officers who had never fired a weapon in anger. Men, women, and a few who identified as neither. They came from every continent on Earth and a dozen colony worlds. They were different in almost every way, but they all had the same look in their eyes. Vasquez did not waste time. He pulled up the tactical display showing the Harrow Swarm and laid out the situation in plain terms. The swarm was massive. Billions of individual bioships, dozens of capital-class high vessels. The swarm had never been defeated in combat. No known fleet had even slowed it down. The Concord had classified it as an extinction-class hazard, which meant that the official recommendation was to evacuate and run. The Valeth can't run, Vasquez said. Their young can't survive FTL transit, so they stay. And if they stay, Armory, we stay? He looked around the table. I'm not going to lie to you, this is the hardest fight any of us have ever faced. We don't have complete intelligence on the swarm's capabilities. We don't know what their weapons do. We don't know if they can adapt. What we do know is that there are 11,000 civilians on that moon, including 3,000 children, and every other species in this galaxy has decided they're acceptable losses. He paused. They're not. Captain Elena Vasek of the destroyer Indomitable spoke up. She was a small woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for saying exactly what she was thinking. Admiral, what are our rules of engagement? Defend the colony, stop the swarm. Don't die if you can help it. Wait, but protect those people if you can't help it. And if we can't stop them, then we slow them down until the 7th Fleet arrives, and then we stop them together. And if we can't stop them together, Vasquez looked at her. His face was stone. Then we buy enough time for someone to figure out how to evacuate those larvae. But Captain Vasek, I have been in this Navy for 35 years, and I have never once seen a human fleet fail to protect the people it came to protect. I do not intend to start today. The room was silent. Then Captain Vasek nodded, once, sharply, and that was all that needed to be said. The briefing continued with tactical details, formation plans, weapons loadouts, communication protocols. It was professional and precise and utterly lacking in drama. Humans did not go to war with speeches and glory. When they went to war with spreadsheets and logistics and a quiet iron determination that was far more frightening than any battle cry. While the captains planned, Lieutenant Commander Priya Sharma sat in a cargo bay on the Marine Transport Calcutta and stared at schematics. Priya was a combat engineer, which meant she built things that kept people alive in places where everything was trying to kill them. She was 31 years old, born in Mumbai, raised on the Mars colony, and had a talent for solving impossible problems under impossible pressure. She also had not slept in 22 hours, but she was too angry to be tired. The schematics were for emergency shelters, standard human military shelters designed for human biology. They were useless for the Valeth. Priya had pulled every piece of data she could find on Valeth physiology. And the list of problems was growing by the hour. The Valeth needed high humidity. Their skin dried out and cracked in arid conditions. They needed controlled temperatures within a narrow range. Their larvae needed water, obviously, but not just any water. It had to be within specific chemical parameters, or their gill membranes would fail. And their hearing was sensitive to vibrations above a certain frequency, which meant that standard military operations, the kind that involved explosions and gunfire and heavy vehicles, could cause them physical pain. She was redesigning the shelters from scratch. She was building in humidity systems, vibration dampeners, aquatic chambers, and atmospheric controls, all using materials that were already on the transport ships because there was no time to order anything new. She was doing this while simultaneously reviewing the geological surveys of Tyre 4 to find the best locations for fortified positions in case the swarm reached the surface. Her team of engineers gathered around her, and they worked together in focused silence, passing tablets back and forth, arguing over stress calculations, and solving problems one after another with the relentless efficiency of people who understood that every hour counted. At one point, Sergeant Kowalski, a large man with hands like shovels, looked at the Valeth biological data and said, "These people are fragile, like really fragile. A strong handshake could bruise them, which is why we're building shelters that can take a direct hit from a swarm breacher and still keep them safe," Priya said without looking up. "If one of those things gets through, the Valeth can't fight. They can't run. They'll be counting on us to be between them and whatever comes." Kowalski nodded slowly. "So we build it right. We build it right." They built it right. They worked through the night, through the artificial day cycle of the ship, and into the next night. They tested their designs in simulations and found flaws and fixed them and tested again. Priya's hands shook from caffeine and exhaustion, and she did not stop. In the quiet hours of the ship's night, when most of the crew was asleep, Priya sat alone in the cargo bay and looked at a holographic image of a Valeth larva. It was tiny, translucent. It glowed with a soft, newborn light, and it floated in its pool with the peaceful ignorance of a creature that did not know the universe was dangerous. She thought about the fact that 3,000 of these small, glowing things were floating in pools on a moon that was about to be devoured. She thought about the fact that every species in the galaxy had looked at them and decided they were not worth the risk. She pressed her palms against her eyes and breathed. Then she went back to work. 16 hours into the journey, the fleet's communications officer intercepted a broadcast from Tyra 4. It was not the distress signal that was still repeating endlessly, unanswered by anyone except the humans. This was something new. It was a message from Colony Master Eolith, directed at the approaching human fleet, asking a single question. "Is it true? Are you really coming?" Vasquez read the message. He thought about it for a moment. And then he dictated a reply and had it sent on the same frequency, in Valeth, run through the best translation software humanity had. The translation was imperfect. The grammar was awkward, and some of the words were wrong, but the meaning was clear. "Hold on, we're coming. Nobody dies today." On Tyra 4, Eolith received the message in the command center. She read it on her display, and then she read it again. Around her, officers who had been dark with fear for days began to flicker, uncertain, fragile lights that did not quite know what to do with themselves. Eolith stared at the message for a long time. The words were clumsy. The translation was clearly done by someone who did not speak Valeth, but there was something in them, a bluntness, a simplicity, and a raw and unpolished sincerity that no amount of elegant language could have matched. "Nobody dies today." She did not know who these humans were. She had read about them, of course. Every species had. The Deathworlders, the heavy-gravity predators from the impossible planet, the species that the galaxy whispered about in equal parts admiration and terror. But she had never spoken to one. She had never received a message from one, and she had certainly never been told by one that nobody was going to die. She pressed her hands against the display as if she could reach through it and touch the person on the other side. Her bioluminescence surged, a sudden, overwhelming wave of color that filled the entire command center with light. It was a color that her species rarely produced, a deep, warm amber that had no exact translation in any other language. The officers around her stared. They had seen every shade of Valeth emotion, but this one was unfamiliar. It was not quite gratitude. It was not quite hope. It was something new, something that sat between the two and could not be named because the Valeth had never needed a word for the feeling of being rescued by strangers. Later, much later, after everything that happened at Tyra 4, the Valith would create a word for it. They would call it Vashran, and they would define it as the light of those who came. It would become one of the most important words in their language. But that was later. Right now, Ioleth simply stood in the command center of her small colony on a small moon at the edge of nowhere, and she glowed, and for the first time in days. So the darkness felt a little less absolute. Two rotations remained. The fleet was coming, the swarm was coming, and the galaxy, watching from a safe distance, held its breath and waited to see what would happen when an unstoppable force met a species that had never learned how to stop. The sky above Tyra 4 changed on the morning of the fourth rotation. Ioleth was standing at the observation dome of the colony's upper level when it happened. She had been watching the stars, the same stars she had watched every night since the signal went out, searching for something she was not sure she believed in. The stars had been cold and empty and indifferent, the way stars always were, and she had started to wonder if the human message had been a lie. Not a cruel lie, maybe a kind one. The kind of lie you told to people who were going to die, so they would not be afraid at the end. Then the sky cracked open. That was what it looked like. A line of white light split the darkness from one horizon to the other, and then another, and the lines multiplied and branched and spread until the entire sky above the colony was filled with streaks of burning light. Each streak was a ship dropping out of hyperspace, decelerating from faster than light to normal space in a controlled burst of energy that lit up the void like a second sunrise. 140 ships. They came out of hyperspace in formation, not scattered, not disorganized, not the ragged arrival of a fleet that had been hastily assembled. They came out in precise geometric patterns. Carriers in the center, destroyers fanning outward, these battle cruisers forming a wall between the moon and the direction the swarm would come from. It was choreographed. It was deliberate. It was the arrival of a military force that had spent the journey preparing for exactly this moment. The Thermopylae came out last, directly above the colony, and it was enormous. From the surface of Tyra 4, it blotted out a patch of stars the size of Ioleth's fist, held at arm's length. Its hull was dark gray and scarred. Old damage from old battles that had been repaired but not polished, because humans did not waste time on appearances when function was what mattered. Ioleth stood at the observation dome with her hands pressed flat against the transparent surface and watched the ships fill her sky. Around her, Valith colonists gathered, drawn by the light, drawn by the noise of the colony's communication systems suddenly flooding with human transmissions, drawn by the simple, overwhelming fact that someone had actually come. They glowed, all of them. Not the dim, frightened flickers of the past days, but real, bright, full-spectrum bioluminescence that turned the observation dome into a cathedral of living light. Some of them shimmered with blues and golds that meant hope. Some pulsed with deep purple that meant awe. And many of them burned with that new color, that warm amber that Ioleth had felt in the command center, the color that did not have a name yet. A young Valith child, barely old enough to walk on land, pressed herself against her mother's leg and pointed at the sky with one thin arm. "What are those?" she asked. Her mother looked up at the fleet. Her light was steady and warm. "Those are humans," she said. "Are they scary?" "Yes," her mother said honestly, "but they are kind of scary." In orbit, Admiral Vasquez surveyed the system from the bridge of the Thermopylae. The tactical display showed Tyra 4 below, a small icy moon with a thin atmosphere and a cluster of colony structures on its surface. The gas giant it orbited, a massive swirl of orange and brown, dominated the background. The system's star was distant and dim. It was a cold, lonely place, and on the far edge of the system, at the limit of long-range sensors, a red stain was spreading across the display. The Harrow Swarm. Still 2 rotations out, but close enough now to register on sensors as individual contacts rather than a single mass. The numbers were staggering. The computer counted contacts and stopped counting at 8 billion because the number became meaningless at that scale. It was not an army, it was a natural disaster, a living storm of hunger and consumption that had been drifting through the galaxy for millennia, and it was heading straight for them. Vasquez studied the display for a long time. He noted the swarm's formation, its speed, the distribution of its hive vessels. He noted the way the smaller bioships clustered around the hive vessels like cells around a nucleus. He noted the gaps, places where the swarm's density was thinner, possible weak points, possible entry corridors for attack runs. He had read every report the Concord had on the Harrow swarm. They were old reports, centuries or millennia out of date, and most of them ended the same way. Total loss. Fleet destroyed. Hidden planet consumed. No survivors. The reports read like obituaries. Vasquez did not intend to write another one. Deploy the phalanx, he ordered. The phalanx was humanity's primary defensive doctrine for large-scale engagements. It was named after an ancient formation used by warriors on Earth thousands of years ago. A wall of shields and spears, each soldier protecting the soldier next to them, creating a barrier that was stronger than any individual could be alone. The modern version was the same idea, scaled up to the size of a star system. The carriers positioned themselves behind the moon, using Tyra 4's mass as partial cover while they launched fighter wings. The destroyers spread out in a wide screening formation, creating an early warning and interception network that would detect and engage swarm elements long before they reached the main line. The battle cruisers formed the wall itself, 37 ships arranged in a curved formation facing the swarm's approach vector, their combined weapons coverage creating overlapping fields of fire that would turn any approaching force into a kill zone. Behind them all, at a safe distance, the hospital ship Florence waited. It was the largest ship in the fleet, a vessel the size of a small city, and it was filled with medical staff, operating rooms, trauma bays, and, as of the past 18 hours, emergency aquatic facilities for Valith patients that the medical team had improvised from cargo containers and water recycling systems. The fleet settled into position, weapons charged, shields activated. Fighters launched in waves, filling the space around the fleet with swarms of small, fast, heavily armed craft that moved like flocks of angry birds. And then they waited. On the surface of Tyra 4, the waiting was different. The marine transports had begun landing within an hour of the fleet's arrival. Heavy shuttles, each one carrying engineers, marines, equipment, and supplies, dropped through the thin atmosphere and touched down on the ice fields surrounding the colony. The colony's landing pads were too small for military transports, so the humans simply found flat ground and landed there instead. Priya Sharma was on the first shuttle down. She stepped out onto the surface of Tyra 4 and felt the cold hit her like a wall. Her environmental suit compensated immediately, but she could still feel the chill pressing against the outside, while looking for a way in. The gravity was light, about 60% of Earth standard, and she had to adjust her stride to avoid bouncing with each step. The colony was smaller than she had expected, a cluster of interconnected domes and tunnels built half into the ice with transparent sections that glowed with soft internal light. It looked fragile. It looked like something that a strong wind could break. She walked toward the main entrance with her team behind her. 20 combat engineers, loaded with equipment, moving with the purposeful speed of people who had a job to do and not enough time to do it. At the entrance, they were met by a Valith. Priya had seen images of the Valith in the files she had studied, but images did not do them justice. The being standing before her was tall and impossibly slender, garnished with skin that was not quite translucent, not quite opaque, somewhere in between like frosted glass lit from inside. She had no hair. Her eyes were large and dark and liquid, and they reflected light like deep water. She wore a simple garment that flowed around her body like seaweed in a current. She was glowing, a soft, shifting pattern of blues and greens that rippled across her skin like sunlight on ocean waves. "I am Sothal," the Valith said. Her voice was quiet, musical, like water running over stones. "I am a researcher here. Colony Master Eoleth asked me to serve as your liaison." Priya looked at her. She was probably a head taller than Priya, but she looked like she weighed nothing. Her arms were thin enough that Priya could have wrapped her fingers around them. She moved carefully, as if aware that the universe was full of things that could break her. "Lieutenant Commander Priya Sharma," Priya said, "combat engineer, we're here to build shelters for your people." Sothal blinked. Her glow flickered. "Shelters?" In case the swarm reaches the surface, we need to protect your civilians, especially the larvae. Can you show me the nursery levels? Sothal stared at her for a moment, and her bioluminescence did something complex, a rapid cycle of colors that Priya's translator could not interpret. Then she nodded and turned to lead them inside. The interior of the colony was warm and humid, a sharp contrast to the frozen surface outside. The corridors were curved and smooth, designed for bodies that preferred flowing movement to sharp turns. And the lighting was soft and came from bioluminescent panels that mimicked the Valeth homeworld's ocean depths. Everything was built for comfort, for gentleness, for a species that had evolved in a place where the most dangerous thing was a strong current. Priya's Marines followed her through the corridors, and they were enormous. The tallest Valeth in the colony was maybe 2 meters. The shortest Marine in Priya's team was 185, and Sergeant Kowalski was 2 meters even and built like a cargo loader. They filled the corridors. Their boots thudded against floors designed for bare feet. Their equipment bumped against walls designed for shoulders half their width. The Valeth watched them pass. Colonists stopped in doorways and pressed against walls, staring with huge dark eyes at these creatures from a world that should have been impossible. Some of them dimmed with instinctive fear. These were predators. Their bodies shouted predator. Everything about them screamed danger. But others glowed with that uncertain amber, because these predators had come to help. Sothal led them to the nursery levels. They descended through the colony into the deeper sections, where the temperature rose and the humidity thickened, until it felt like walking through warm fog. The nursery was the heart of the colony, a series of large chambers filled with shallow pools of carefully maintained water, each one glowing with the soft bioluminescence of hundreds of Valeth larvae. Priya stepped to the edge of the nearest pool and looked down. The larvae were small, maybe 15 centimeters long, with translucent bodies and tiny flickering lights that pulsed in slow, dreamy patterns. They drifted in the warm water with no awareness of what was happening above them, turning slowly, bumping gently against each other, alive and innocent and terribly vulnerable. There were hundreds of them in this pool alone, and there were dozens of pools, 3,000 larvae, 3,000 children who could not be moved, could not be evacuated, could not fight, could not run. 3,000 reasons why the fleet above had crossed the galaxy. Priya was quiet for a long time. Then she turned to her team. We fortify this level first. I want blast-rated walls on every access corridor, vibration dampeners on the ceiling and floor. Check the frequency tolerances, Kowalski. Their young can't handle anything above 400 hertz. The pools need independent temperature and chemical regulation in case the main systems fail. And I want emergency air seals on every room. If the upper colony is breached, the nursery stays intact. Is that clear? It was clear. The engineers went to work. They worked through the day and into the night. They hauled materials from the shuttles, cut and welded and bolted and sealed, building walls within walls, shelters within shelters. They were not gentle workers. They were loud and they moved fast and the ground shook under their boots. But they were careful. They were so careful. They checked and rechecked their vibration levels. They tested the humidity systems over and over. They handled Valeth infrastructure with the kind of attention that seemed at odds with their size and strength. At one point, a section of the nursery wall needed reinforcement, and the only way to reach it was to work directly above one of the larval pools. Sergeant Kowalski, the largest person on the team, suspended himself from a ceiling beam with his legs and welded a blast plate into position while hanging upside down, because it was the only angle that would not disturb the pool below. Sothal watched this with an expression that her bioluminescence could not quite translate. A human twice her mass, hanging from a ceiling, welding armor plating to protect children that were not his own. She did not have a framework for this. Nothing in her experience, nothing in her species' history explained what she was seeing. She followed Priya everywhere. She helped where she could, translating between the engineers and the colony staff, explaining Valeth needs, and answering questions. She watched Priya work with a focus that bordered on obsession, solving problem after problem, refusing to rest, refusing to slow down. During a brief pause, while Priya drank water and reviewed the next phase of construction, Sothal sat beside her and asked the question that had been building in her since the humans arrived. "Why did you come?" Priya looked at her. What do you mean? The Concorde refused. Every species refused. They said the risk was too great, the Harrow too dangerous. They were not wrong. The Harrow has never been defeated. The logical response is to protect yourself. The strategic response is to sacrifice the few to save the many. Every analysis supports this conclusion. She paused. But you came anyway. Your entire fleet came. You are building shelters for our children. You are going to fight a force that has destroyed every fleet that has ever faced it. And you gain nothing from this. We have nothing to offer you. We are a small species with no military, no strategic value, no resources worth fighting for. She looked at Priya with her dark, liquid eyes. Why? Priya set down her water. She was quiet for a moment. The nursery hummed around them, with the soft sound of water filters and the gentle glow of sleeping larvae. Because you asked for help, Priya said. That's it. That's the whole reason. You were in trouble, you asked for help, and we could help. I don't need anything from you. My admiral doesn't need anything from you. Nobody in this fleet needs anything from you. We didn't come here because of strategy or politics or resources. We came because you're in trouble and we can help, and that is all the reason we have ever needed. She looked at Sothal. Where I come from, when someone asks for help, you help, and you don't ask what you get in return. You just help. Sothal's glow shifted. The amber deepened, spread, filled her entire body with warm light. She did not speak for a long time. Then she said very quietly, My people have a light for every emotion we have ever felt. We have lights for joy and grief and anger and love and fear and every shade in between. But I do not have a light for what I feel right now. There is no word for it, no color. Maybe you'll have to make a new one, Priya said. Maybe we will. They sat together in the warm glow of the nursery, and outside, above them, the fleet hung in the dark like a wall of iron and fire. And beyond the fleet, the swarm was coming. In orbit, the Concord observation flotilla arrived. 12 ships from 8 different species, each one carrying diplomats, military observers, journalists, and historians. They were not here to help. They were here to watch. The flotilla positioned itself at the edge of the system, far enough from Tyra 4 to be safe, but close enough to get good sensor readings. On the lead ship, a Rilshari vessel called the Eternal Perspective, observers gathered at their screens and studied the human fleet with professional interest. Most of them expected to be recording a disaster. The humans were brave, certainly, perhaps admirable in their way. But bravery did not win against the Harrow Swarm. Nothing won against the Harrow Swarm. That was the whole point. The observers had prepared analyses, eulogies, and editorial pieces about the tragedy of humanity's noble but doomed effort. A few of them, however, were less certain. A Drellcath observer named Kareth, the same analyst who had been studying the human files, sat at her station and watched the fleet's deployment with all 6 of her eyes focused on different data streams. She was tracking their formation, their weapon signatures, their communication patterns. They're not panicking, she said to her supervisor. Why would they panic? They haven't seen the swarm yet. They have. Their sensors are better than ours. They've been tracking the swarm since they arrived. They know exactly how big it is. She pointed at her screen. Look at their formation. It's defensive but aggressive. They're not setting up to retreat. They're setting up to fight. All of them. In every ship is positioned to engage. Her supervisor looked at the data. They know they're outnumbered by a factor of millions. Yes. And they're staying. Yes. Her supervisor was quiet for a moment. Then he said, record everything. Whatever happens here, the Concorde needs to see it. On the surface of Tyra 4, the shelters were nearly complete. Priya and her team had worked for 30 straight hours, and the nursery level was now a fortress within a colony. Blast walls, environmental controls, emergency systems, independent power supplies. It was not pretty. The military-grade materials clashed with the soft, organic architecture of the Valith colony like a scar on silk. But it was strong. It would hold. The upper levels had been fortified too. Marine positions were established at every entrance, every corridor junction, at every vulnerable point. Heavy weapons emplacements covered the approaches from the landing fields. The Marines themselves were dug in and ready, armored figures standing at attention in corridors built for people half their size. Priya stood at the entrance to the nursery level and ran a final check on the blast doors. They were solid. She had tested them herself. She turned to Sothal, who had not left her side the entire time. "When the fighting starts," Priya said, "you stay in the nursery with your people. These doors will hold. The walls will hold. No matter what you hear up here, you stay down there. Do you understand?" Sothal's glow dimmed slightly. "And you? Where will you be?" "Up here, between the swarm and those doors. That is dangerous. That's the point." Sothal looked at her for a long time. Her light cycled through colors, fear and gratitude and something deeper that had no name. Then she reached out and touched Priya's hand. Her fingers were cool and thin and very gentle, and they left a faint trace of bioluminescence on Priya's skin, like a fingerprint made of light. "Come back," Sothal said. "When it is over, come back." Priya looked at the trace of light on her hand. She closed her fingers around it. "I'll come back." In orbit, the sensors screamed. The Harrow swarm entered the system. On the bridge of the Thermopylae, every display turned red. The swarm's leading edge was visible on long-range cameras now, not as individual ships, but as a shadow, a darkness that blotted out the stars behind it, spreading across the sky like ink dropped in water. It was so vast that the cameras could not capture its full extent. The edges trailed off into nothing, and the center was so dense that it registered on sensors as a solid object. It was bigger than the initial estimates, much bigger. The leading edge alone was wider than the orbital gap between Tyra 4 and its gas giant. The depth of the swarm was immeasurable. It was not a fleet. It was an ocean of teeth and hunger, and it was rolling toward them with the slow, patient inevitability of a tide. The bridge was silent. Every officer stared at the display. Some of them had been confident before, secure in the knowledge that the human fleet was powerful and well-prepared. That confidence wavered now, not because they were afraid, but because what they were looking at was simply beyond the scale of anything they had ever imagined fighting. Admiral Vasquez stood at the command table and looked at the swarm. He was quiet for a long time. His face showed nothing. Not fear, not doubt, not bravado. Just a calm, steady focus, like a man studying a problem and deciding how to solve it. Then he turned to his communications officer. "Open a channel, all frequencies, broadcast to the swarm." The officer complied. The channel opened with a soft chime. Vasquez spoke. His voice was flat, unhurried, the voice of a man who had made his decision a long time ago and was simply informing the universe of what that decision was. "Harrow Swarm, this is Admiral Renko Vasquez, United Nations Space Command. The Tyra 4 system is under human protection. The colony on this moon is defended. You will alter your course. This is not a request." He waited. The bridge waited. The fleet waited. The swarm kept coming. There was no response, no signal, no acknowledgement. Just the relentless, silent advance of billions of hungry things. Vasquez nodded, as if he had expected exactly this. "Very well," he said. He turned to his XO. "Sound general quarters, all ships to battle stations. Weapons free on my command." Across the fleet, alarms sounded. The low, thrumming pulse of general quarters echoed through every ship, every corridor, every compartment. Crew members moved to their stations. Weapon systems powered up. Shields reached full strength. Fighter wings formed into attack formations and held position, waiting for the order. On the surface of Tyra 4, Priya heard the alert through her communication system. She looked up at the sky through the colony's observation dome and saw the fleet above, their running lights blazing in the dark. Their weapon signatures visible as faint halos of energy around each ship. And beyond the fleet, at the edge of the sky, she saw the darkness growing. She turned away from the dome and walked to her position at the nursery entrance. Behind the blast doors, she could hear the soft sounds of the colony. Valith voices, the gentle splash of the nursery pools, the faint glow of 3,000 larvae who did not know what was coming. She checked her weapons. She checked her armor. She checked the blast doors one more time. Then she stood and she waited. On the bridge of the Thermopylae, Vasquez looked at the approaching swarm. It filled the entire forward display now, a wall of darkness that seemed to eat the light itself. His XO, Commander Torres, stood beside him, her face pale but her hands steady. "Admiral," she said quietly. "Eeyore, that is a lot of bugs." Vasquez looked at the display. He looked at it for a long moment, and then the corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "Good," he said. "I'd hate to have come all this way for nothing." He straightened his uniform. He placed his hands behind his back. He looked out at the darkness. "All ships, this is the Admiral. The swarm is here. You know why we're here. You know what's behind us. Hold the line." He paused. "Hold the line." The first wave hit like a hammer striking glass. 8 billion bioships did not attack all at once. They came in waves, organized by some intelligence deep inside the hive vessels, pushed forward in coordinated surges that tested the defensive line, probed for weaknesses, and applied pressure in ways that suggested the Harrow Swarm was not just a mindless force of nature, but something that thought, that planned, that learned. The first wave was a test, roughly 200 million small bioships, each one the size of a human fighter craft, built from chitin and muscle and acid, driven by biological engines that burned organic fuel and left trails of toxic exhaust, separated from the main body and accelerated toward the human fleet. 200 million. That was the test. On the bridge of the Thermopylae, Vasquez watched them come. The tactical display showed the wave as a red tide rushing toward the thin blue line of his fleet. The numbers were absurd. His 140 ships against 200 million. But humans had never been particularly good at math that told them to give up. "Screening formation, engage at maximum range," Vasquez ordered. "Carriers, launch all remaining fighter wings. Destroyers, weapons free." The fleet opened fire. It started with the destroyers. 40 ships spread across the screening formation, each one loaded with point defense batteries and medium-range weapon systems that humanity had spent centuries perfecting. They fired in coordinated volleys, timed to create overlapping kill zones where no swarm element could pass without flying through a crossfire. The first volley hit the leading edge of the swarm wave and tore it apart. Thousands of bioships detonated, their organic hulls shredded by kinetic rounds and burned by plasma bolts. The destruction was massive, visible from the surface of Tyra, 4 as distant flashes of light, like a thunderstorm on the horizon. But the wave did not stop. The destroyed ships were replaced instantly by the ones behind them, and the wave kept coming, absorbing the losses the way an ocean absorbs rain. The destroyers kept firing. Behind them, the carrier groups launched their fighter wings. Thousands of small, fast, heavily armed craft piloted by men and women who had trained for exactly this kind of chaos. The fighters met the swarm wave head-on, diving into the massive bioships and tearing corridors through them with guns and missiles and, in several cases, with the sheer kinetic force of their own ships used as battering rams. Fighter pilot Lieutenant Yuki Tanaka flew her craft into the thickest part of the wave and found herself surrounded by bioships on every side. They were ugly things. Segmented bodies, multiple limbs. Its jaws that opened in ways that suggested they had been designed by something that understood biology but had never heard of beauty. They swarmed around her ship like insects around a light, trying to latch on, trying to bite through her hull. She killed 12 of them in the first 30 seconds. Her wingman killed 8 more. They carved a path through the wave and came out the other side trailing smoke and chitin fragments, banked hard, and dove back in. Across the engagement zone, the same scene repeated hundreds of times. Human fighters engaged the swarm in close combat, dancing through the mass with a speed and precision that the swarm's intelligence had clearly not anticipated. Human reflexes were faster than the bioship's response time. Human pilots were more creative, more adaptive, more willing to take risks that no rational analysis would support. And human ships were tough. A bioship latched onto Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb's fighter and tore off his port wing. He flew the next 4 minutes on one wing and raw attitude thrusters, killed 9 more contacts, and landed on the carrier Yorktown with a ship that looked like it had been chewed on by something very large. He climbed out of the cockpit, asked for a new ship, and was back in the fight in 20 minutes. The first wave broke. Not defeated, the swarm did not experience defeat the way other forces did, but disrupted, scattered, reduced from a coordinated assault to a chaotic cloud of individual ships that the human fleet's defenses could pick off one by one. Within 2 hours, the first wave was gone, 200 million destroyed, and the fleet had lost 3 fighters and 2 pilots. On the Concorde observation flotilla, Kareth the Drellcath analyst ran the numbers 3 times. Her hands were shaking. "They destroyed the first wave," she said. 200 million contacts, all of them. Her supervisor did not respond. He was staring at the data with his mouth slightly open. "The Harrow has never lost a first engagement," Kareth continued. "In 800 cycles of recorded encounters, no fleet has ever survived initial contact. The humans didn't just survive, they won." "It was only the first wave," her supervisor said, finding his voice. "The swarm is testing them." "I know," Kareth said. "That's what frightens me. Because the humans are testing the swarm too." The second wave was not a test. It was an assault. The hive vessels pushed forward, and in this time they sent everything. Not the full 8 billion, but a significant portion. A wall of bioships so dense it blocked the starlight. Mixed into the wave were larger organisms, assault carriers that could spawn new bioships mid-battle, siege beasts that were essentially living battering rams designed to crack open defensive formations, and acid bombers that trailed clouds of corrosive gas behind them. The wave hit the destroyer screen, and this time it pushed through. The destroyers fought hard. They held their positions and poured fire into the advancing mass, and they killed millions. But the sheer weight of numbers was overwhelming. The swarm flowed around them like water around stones, engulfing individual ships in clouds of bioships that latched on and began eating through their hulls. And the destroyer Reliant was the first to fall. A siege beast rammed it amidships, cracking its hull open like an egg. And before the crew could evacuate, 1,000 bioships swarmed into the breach and began consuming the ship from the inside. Captain Park ordered the reactor to be shut down to prevent a core breach, but it was too late. The Reliant broke apart in a cloud of debris and organic matter, and the swarm consumed the pieces. But the Reliant's crew did not die quietly. As the ship came apart around them, the surviving crew members fought. They fought with rifles and sidearms, and when those ran out, with tools and fists and whatever they could grab. They fought in corridors that were filling with acid and heat and alien bodies, and they kept fighting because that was what humans did. And the Reliant's final transmission was not a distress call. It was a situation report, delivered by a petty officer with a broken arm, calmly listing the swarm's observed weaknesses for the benefit of the fleet. The destroyer screen bent. It did not break. The remaining destroyers pulled into tighter formations, covering each other, creating smaller but more concentrated kill zones. They gave ground, slowly, deliberately, drawing the swarm deeper into the defensive network where the battlecruisers waited. And then the battlecruisers opened fire. 37 ships, each one carrying weapons designed to kill things much bigger than bioships. Their main batteries fired in sequence, and the effect was devastating. Beams of focused energy cut through the swarm like blades through cloth, one carving corridors of destruction that stretched for kilometers. Kinetic rounds the size of ground cars slammed into siege beasts and reduced them to clouds of organic debris. Missile salvos detonated inside the swarm's dense formations, and each explosion killed thousands. The battlecruiser wall held. The swarm crashed against it and was broken, reformed and crashed again, was broken again. The space between the fleets became a graveyard of shattered bioships and burning debris, a killing field that grew wider and deeper with every minute. But the swarm had numbers that defied comprehension, and it learned. On the third surge, the hive vessels changed tactics. They sent their assault carriers forward, and the carriers began spawning fresh bioships directly into the engagement zone. For every 1,000 destroyed, 500 were born. So the math shifted. The kill rate was no longer enough. The swarm found the gaps. It happened on the left flank first. A concentration of bioships punched through the destroyer screen at a point where 2 ships had been forced to separate, and the stream of alien bodies poured through the hole like water through a crack in a dam. They bypassed the battlecruiser line entirely and headed straight for Tyra 4. "Breach on the left flank," Torres shouted from her station. "Estimated 50,000 contacts heading for the surface." Close the gap, Vasquez ordered. Redirect Destroyer Group 4. Carrier Midway. Launch interceptors to second breach, right flank. Larger, at least 200,000 contacts in a siege beast. Vasquez's jaw tightened. The swarm was not stupid. Hornet it had identified his fleet's coverage limits, and it was punching through at multiple points simultaneously, forcing him to split his response. All carriers, priority intercept. Stop whatever you can in orbit. He paused for 1 second. Then, signal the ground forces. Tell them company is coming. On the surface of Tyra 4, the alarm screamed. Priya Sharma heard them from her position at the nursery entrance. She had been standing there for hours, watching the battle through the colony's external cameras, watching the distant lights flash and flare as ships fought and died in the dark above. Now the cameras showed something new. Bright streaks cutting through the thin atmosphere. Dozens of them, hundreds like meteors falling from a burning sky. The swarm was landing. All positions. This is Lieutenant Commander Sharma, she said into her communication system. Ground contacts inbound. Multiple entry points. All Marines to defensive positions. Engineers, seal the colony. Nobody gets past us. The Marine garrison on Tyra 4 was not large. 600 soldiers, supported by Priya's engineering team and their heavy equipment. They had been dug in for 2 days, fortifying every approach, mining every landing zone, setting up interlocking fields of fire that would turn the ice fields around the colony into a killing ground. It was not enough. They all knew it was not enough. 600 Marines against a force that could number in the hundreds of thousands. The math was just as impossible on the ground as it was in orbit. But humans did not fight by math. They fought by will. Out of the first swarm, drop pods hit the ice 3 kilometers from the colony. They were not elegant. Biological capsules that slammed into the ground and split open like eggs, disgorging swarm soldiers. The ground forms were different from the space forms. They were built for gravity, for close combat. They had 6 legs, armored carapaces, and jaws lined with teeth that could cut through metal. They were fast. They were strong, and they came in waves, pouring out of the drop pods and surging toward the colony like a flood. The mines went off first. The ice fields erupted in a chain of explosions that killed thousands of swarm soldiers in the first seconds. The explosions threw up clouds of ice and debris that briefly obscured the battlefield. And when the clouds settled, the swarm had been thinned but not stopped. The survivors kept coming, was crawling over the bodies of the dead without slowing down. The Marines opened fire. 600 rifles, heavy weapons emplacements, automated turrets, everything they had. The sound was enormous, a continuous roar of gunfire and explosions that shook the colony's walls and rattled the teeth of every human inside. The swarm hit the outer defensive line, and the fighting became close. Sergeant First Class Maria Delgado held a position at the colony's eastern approach with a squad of 12 Marines. She had served for 15 years, had fought in 2 of humanity's 3 prior engagements, and considered herself difficult to surprise. The swarm surprised her. They were faster than she expected. The first one reached her line in seconds, leaping over a barrier with its 6 legs churning, and she shot it in the head at point-blank range. And the second one was right behind it. The third came from the side. Her squad fired continuously, and the bodies piled up in front of their position, and more kept coming. "Fall back to secondary line," Delgado ordered. Her squad moved, disciplined, covering each other, falling back in pairs while maintaining fire. They reached the secondary line and dug in again, and the swarm followed them, relentless. Across the perimeter, the same fight played out at every position. The Marines held, fell back, held again. They traded ground for time, making the swarm pay for every meter with bodies. The ice around the colony turned dark with alien blood, thick black fluid that steamed in the cold air. But the swarm kept coming, and the drop pods kept falling. Priya heard the fighting above her and felt the vibrations through the floor. She was inside the colony now, at the entrance to the nursery level, standing behind the blast door she had built. Behind her, the Valith huddled in the shelters, 11,000 civilians packed into reinforced chambers, their bioluminescence dimmed with fear. In the nursery pools, the larvae drifted peacefully, unaware of the hell unfolding above them. Sothal was beside Priya. She had refused to go deeper into the shelters. Priya had argued with her, had told her it was dangerous, had ordered her to get behind the blast doors. Sothal had looked at her with those dark, liquid eyes and said, "You are staying, I am staying," and that had been the end of the argument. The fighting reached the colony. A swarm breacher, a larger organism, built like a battering ram with acid-tipped limbs, smashed through the colony's eastern wall. It tore through the outer structure as if it were made of paper, ripping open corridors and chambers, and behind it poured a flood of ground soldiers. Marines met them in the corridors. The fighting was brutal and close. Human rifles fired at point-blank range. Alien jaws snapped at human armor. The corridors were too narrow for proper tactics, so it became a matter of strength and will, and the refusal to take one step backward. Private First Class Tomas Rivera was 19 years old and had never seen combat. He stood in a corridor with his rifle and watched the swarm come toward him, a wall of armored bodies and cutting jaws, and his hands shook so badly he could barely aim. Then he thought about the nursery behind him. He thought about 3,000 larvae floating in warm water. He thought about the fact that they were counting on him even though they did not know he existed. He stopped shaking. He raised his rifle. He fired. He held that corridor for 7 minutes, alone after his squad was forced to fall back, firing and reloading and firing again until reinforcements arrived. When they found him, he was standing in a pile of dead swarm soldiers that reached his knees, his armor cracked, his face bloody from a cut above his eye, and his rifle so hot that the barrel glowed. "You okay, kid?" the sergeant asked. Rivera looked at him. "They didn't get past me." "No," the sergeant said. "They didn't." On the upper levels, the fighting intensified. The swarm poured through multiple breaches in the colony's walls, and the Marines fought them in every corridor, every room, every stairwell. The colony was never built for war. Its soft curves and gentle architecture became a maze of close-quarters combat where the advantage shifted back and forth with every turn. And then the worst happened. A second breacher hit the section directly above the nursery. It tore through the floor, the actual floor, and dropped into the level where Priya and Sothal were standing. It was enormous, 3 meters tall, its carapace dripping with acid that hissed and smoked where it touched the ground. Behind it, ground soldiers poured through the hole like ants from a broken nest. Priya did not think. She did not calculate. She did not weigh the odds. She raised her weapon and fired directly into the breacher's face. The first shot staggered it. The second cracked its carapace. The third blew a hole through its head. And it collapsed in a heap of twitching limbs and acid that splashed across the floor and onto Priya's armor. The acid ate through the outer layer immediately, and she felt heat, intense, burning heat, across her left arm and back. She did not stop. The ground soldiers were coming through the gap, and behind her was the nursery. Behind her were 3,000 children and Sothal and the blast doors that she had built with her own hands. She fired. She fell back. She fired again. Her engineering team joined her. Kowalski with a heavy weapon that he braced against his hip and fired from the shoulder because there was no time to set up properly. 2 other engineers with rifles, all of them pouring fire into the breach. A ground soldier got past the fire. It lunged at Priya and its jaws clamped down on her right arm. She felt the pressure. Shore felt the armor crack, felt something in her forearm break. She screamed, a raw animal sound of pain, and she grabbed the creature's jaw with her left hand and forced it open. The creature was strong. She was stronger because behind her were children, and humans who were protecting children were capable of things that biology alone could not explain. She pried the jaw open and shot the creature through the mouth. It fell. Another took its place. She shot that one too. The breach was too wide. More were coming. Too many. Priya was wounded. Her arm was broken, her back was burned, and the acid was eating through more of her armor. She could not hold this position alone. She made a decision. "Kowalski, seal the breach. Use the emergency welding charges." "That'll seal us on this side," Kowalski shouted. "I know. Do it." Kowalski hesitated for exactly 1 second. Then he pulled the emergency charges from his pack, slammed them against the edges of the breach, and triggered them. The charges detonated with a roar of heat and light, and molten metal flowed across the gap. fusing the broken edges together, sealing the breach in a crude but effective wall of cooling steel. The swarm soldiers on their side of the seal, about a dozen, were trapped. Priya, Kowalski, and 2 engineers killed them in the next 45 seconds. It was not clean. It was not pretty. It was survival at its most basic level. When the last one fell, Priya slumped against the wall. Her arm hung at a wrong angle. Her back was on fire. The acid burns had reached her skin through the damaged armor, and the pain was so intense that her vision blurred. Sothal was there. She knelt beside Priya, her bioluminescence blazing so brightly that it lit up the entire corridor. She was shaking. Her thin hands hovered over Priya's wounds without touching, afraid to cause more pain, desperate to help. "Priya," she said. "Priya, you're hurt." "The breach is sealed," Priya said. Her voice was thin. "Check the blast doors. Are the larvae safe?" Sothal looked at the blast doors. They were intact. The nursery beyond was silent and undamaged. "They're safe," she said. "Good." Priya closed her eyes. "Good." Sothal held her. She wrapped her thin arms around Priya's shoulders, carefully avoiding the burns, and her light pulsed in a slow, steady rhythm. Warm amber, deep and gentle, the rhythm of a heartbeat translated into light. It was a Valith healing ritual, one that mothers used with their injured young. It could not fix broken bones or heal burns, but it said, "You are not alone. You are cared for. You are safe." Priya leaned into her. She was in pain. She was exhausted. She had just fought off a wave of alien soldiers with a broken arm and acid burns. And she felt safe because Sothal was there, glowing gently in the dark, and sometimes that was enough. Above them, the battle raged on. In orbit, the situation had become desperate. The swarm had breached the line in 4 places now, and streams of bioships were getting through to the surface. The destroyer screen was in tatters. 8 destroyers lost, 6 more damaged. The battlecruiser line was holding, but it was taking punishment. The Thermopylae itself had taken 3 direct hits from siege beasts, and one entire section of the ship was venting atmosphere. And then the Kursk happened. The battlecruiser Kursk was positioned on the right flank when a hive vessel, a massive, living command ship the size of an asteroid, made a direct run at the defensive line. Hive vessels were the brains of the swarm. They coordinated the bioships, directed attacks, spawned replacements. Destroying a hive vessel would disrupt an entire sector of the swarm's operations. Captain Dmitry Volkov of the Kursk saw the hive vessel coming and made a decision. He broke formation and charged directly at it, putting his ship in the path of the largest enemy in the battle. The Kursk hit the hive vessel with everything it had: main batteries, secondary weapons, missiles, point defense, all of it focused on a single target. The hive vessel's organic armor was meters thick, and the first salvos barely scratched it. But Volkov kept firing, and his crew kept firing, and they closed the distance until the 2 ships were so close that missed shots were impossible. The hive vessel rammed the Kursk. The impact was cataclysmic. The Kursk lost 40% of its hull in an instant. Entire decks were crushed. Atmosphere vented from a dozen breaches. The ship's spine broke, and the forward section twisted at an angle that meant the structural integrity was gone. The Kursk kept firing. From the wreckage of his bridge, Volkov directed fire through backup systems. His crew, many of them wounded, many of them in compartments that were open to vacuum, continued to operate their weapons. The Kursk poured fire into the hive vessel's exposed interior, targeting the organic structures that served as its brain and nervous system. The hive vessel died. It shuddered. It convulsed and went dark. Its bioship escorts went wild, losing coordination, attacking randomly. An entire sector of the swarm's assault collapsed into chaos. The Kursk drifted in the wreckage, broken but alive. Emergency beacons activated. Rescue shuttles launched from the carrier group. Captain Volkov was pulled from the bridge with a collapsed lung and burns over 30% of his body. He was conscious. His first words to the rescue team were, "Did we get it?" "You got it, sir." "Good." He passed out. On the Concord observation flotilla, the observers had stopped taking notes. They were just watching, many of them standing at their stations because they could not sit still. Several were crying. A Rilshari diplomat who had voted against intervention in the Senate 3 days ago sat alone in a corner and stared at nothing, his silver skin dull with something that looked a lot like shame. Kareth recorded everything. Her report would later be classified as one of the most important military documents in conquered history, but right now she was not thinking about history. She was thinking about the crew of the Kursk, who had rammed a living mountain to protect a moon full of strangers, and she was trying to understand how a species could be capable of that. The battle turned. 18 hours after the first wave, the 7th Fleet arrived. 60 ships dropped out of hyperspace on the swarm's left flank, fresh and armed and moving at attack speed. Rear Admiral James Okafor had spent the entire journey studying the Second Fleet's engagement data, identifying the swarm's coordination patterns, mapping the positions of the remaining hive vessels. He did not waste time with speeches. All ships, target the hive vessels. Kill the brain. Kill the swarm. Execute. The 7th Fleet hit the swarm like a knife in the side. Fresh weapons, full ammunition, undamaged ships. They tore into the swarm's command structure with surgical precision. Hive vessel after hive vessel was targeted and destroyed, and with each one that fell, a section of the swarm lost coordination. The combined human fleet, what was left of the 2nd and all of the 7th, pressed the advantage. Vasquez ordered a general advance, and the battle cruiser line moved forward for the first time in the battle, pushing into the swarm, grinding it down, breaking it apart. The swarm fought back. It fought hard, and more human ships were lost and more humans died. The destroyer Indomitable, to her hull already damaged from hours of fighting, was swarmed by a concentrated mass of bioships that dragged her out of formation. Captain Elena Vasic, the woman who had asked Vasquez what would happen if they could not win, found herself surrounded and cut off. She did not panic. She opened a fleet-wide channel and said, calm and clear, "This is Captain Vasic of the Indomitable. I am going to overload my reactor. I suggest you give me some room." The nearby ships pulled back. Vasic detonated the Indomitable's reactor core. The explosion consumed the ship and every bioship within a 10-kilometer radius. The flash was so bright it was visible from the surface of Tyra 4. Her final transmission, recorded by the fleet's communication systems, was her crew singing, not a war song, a lullaby. An old Earth lullaby that one of the crew members had started and others had picked up, their voices steady and calm as the reactor core built toward detonation. On the Concorde observation flotilla, a Morthani diplomat heard the recording and asked Kareth what it was. Kareth explained. The Morthani was silent for a very long time, and then she said, "They sang to the dark." "Yes," Kareth said. "Why?" Kareth did not have an answer. She would spend the rest of her career looking for one. The swarm broke. It did not happen all at once. It happened in stages. First, the flanks collapsed as hive vessels were destroyed and their bioships lost cohesion. Then the center faltered as the combined human fleet concentrated its fire. And then, for the first time in the 800 cycles of the Harrow Swarm's recorded existence, it retreated. The retreat was not a rout. It was calculated, controlled. Whatever intelligence guided the Harrow recognized something it had never encountered before. A prey species that did not weaken as the fight went on, but instead grew more dangerous. A species that lost ships and kept fighting, that lost friends and fought harder, that stood in the path of an extinction-class hazard and said no. The swarm pulled back, regrouped at the edge of the system, and then turned away. It changed course, heading back into the deep dark of the ashfall expanse. The bioships folded their limbs. The hive vessels dimmed. The wall of hunger and teeth that had blotted out the stars receded like a tide going out. The sensors cleared. The stars came back. On the bridge of the battered, broken, but still functioning Thermopylae, Admiral Vasquez sat down heavily in his command chair. The tactical display was clearing, the red stain of the swarm fading from the edges of the screen. Around him, his bridge crew was silent, stunned, exhausted. Torres stood beside him, her face smudged with smoke from a console fire that had broken out during the battle. She was swaying on her feet. "They're gone," she said. "They're actually gone." Vasquez nodded. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He looked at the casualty reports that were beginning to scroll across his display. Ship names, crew names, numbers that represented people who had been alive this morning and were not alive now. "Get me the names," he said quietly. "Every single one." On the surface of Tyra 4, the guns fell silent. Priya heard it, the absence of sound, the sudden, shocking quiet after hours of constant noise. She was still sitting against the wall where Sothal had held her, and for a moment she thought she had gone deaf. Then she heard the soft sounds of the nursery behind the blast doors, the gentle splash of water, the quiet hum of environmental systems, the faint pulse of larval bioluminescence. 3,000 larvae still floating in their pools, still alive, still glowing. Priya closed her eyes. Something hot ran down her face, and she realized she was crying. Sothal held her tighter. Her light was steady and warm. Tyra 4 still turned. The colony still stood. 11,000 Valeth were alive because 200 human ships had crossed the galaxy and stood in the path of the dark. The battle was over. The cost had been enormous, but the line had held. The SOS wasn't ignored. Deathworlders sent a fleet to the aliens, and the galaxy held its breath. Part 5. The galaxy remembers the silence after the battle was louder than the battle itself. For 3 days, the human fleet held position around Tyra 4. The ships that could still move arranged themselves in a defensive formation, battered and broken and still bristling with weapons. The ships that could not move were towed into stable orbits and anchored there, their crews evacuated to functioning vessels. The wreckage that could not be saved was marked with transponder beacons so it could be found later, because every piece of debris had once been part of a ship with a name and a crew, and humans did not leave their dead in unmarked graves. The hospital ship Florence moved to the center of the formation and opened every bay it had. Shuttle after shuttle carried wounded from the fleet to its massive medical facilities. Human crew members with burns and broken bones and missing limbs pulled from wrecked compartments and damaged corridors, and in one case from the vacuum of space itself, where a Marine had survived for 11 minutes in a cracked suit by the sheer stubbornness of his biology. But the Florence was not only treating humans. Valeth from the colony had been injured during the ground assault. Ceiling collapses, acid contamination, injuries from the fighting that had spilled into the colony's corridors. The human medical staff had spent the journey to Tyra for studying Valeth biology, and they put that knowledge to work now with a focus that bordered on obsession. Valeth physiology was delicate. Their bones were thin and hollow, designed for a low-gravity aquatic environment. Their skin was sensitive to chemicals that humans considered harmless. Their circulatory system used a copper-based fluid instead of iron-based blood, which meant that standard human medical supplies were useless or dangerous for them. Everything had to be adapted, improvised, invented on the spot. The Florence's chief medical officer, Commander Dr. Ediz Nwosu, had not slept in 4 days. She stood in the medical bay surrounded by holographic displays showing Valeth anatomical charts that her team had compiled from scratch during the journey, and she directed the treatment of 37 injured Valeth with a calm, methodical precision that masked the fact that she was learning as she went. A young Valeth male had suffered acid burns across his torso from a swarm breacher that had sprayed fluid into a corridor before being killed. His skin was damaged in a pattern that no Valeth doctor had ever treated, because Valeth did not normally survive acid attacks. Nwosu studied the damage, consulted with the colony's medical staff through a translator, and developed a treatment using a modified skin graft technique that combined human regenerative medicine with Valeth bioluminescent tissue samples. It worked. The young male's skin began to heal, and after 2 days his bioluminescence returned in the treated areas. Faint at first, then growing stronger, until the new skin glowed as brightly as the old. When his family came to see him, they stood in the doorway of the medical bay and stared at the human doctors and nurses who were caring for their son. They did not speak. They simply glowed. That deep, warm amber that was becoming the defining color of Tyre 4 in the days after the battle. Nwosu, who did not understand Valeth bioluminescence and had no idea what amber meant, smiled at them and said, "He's going to be fine." The mother's glow intensified so much that it lit up the entire corridor. On the surface of Tyra 4, the colony was being repaired. The human engineers who had built the shelters now turned their skills to rebuilding what the swarm had broken. The eastern wall, torn open by the breacher, was sealed and reinforced. The corridors where Marines had fought and died were cleaned, repaired, and restored. The upper levels where the ceiling had collapsed were shored up with temporary supports that the engineers promised would be replaced with permanent structures as soon as materials arrived. The Valeth watched the humans work, and they watched them with a kind of quiet wonder that went beyond gratitude. These enormous, heavy creatures, these Deathworlders, these beings from a planet that should have killed everything on it, moved through the colony with a care that seemed impossible for their size. They ducked through doorways designed for smaller bodies. They spoke in soft voices when they were near the nursery levels. They learned to move slowly around Valeth children, who were fascinated by them and followed them everywhere, reaching up with tiny glowing hands to touch their armor and their tools. Sergeant Kowalski, who was built like a piece of industrial equipment and had a face that would frighten most species in the galaxy, sat on the floor of a corridor one afternoon and let 6 Valeth children climb on him. They explored his armor with their tiny fingers, poked at his tools, pulled at his beard, and glowed in every color of the rainbow. Kowalski sat perfectly still, his huge hands flat on the ground, and let them do whatever they wanted. A Valeth mother watched from a doorway, her light shifting between anxiety and something softer. "They are not afraid of him?" the colony's doctor asked, standing beside her. "They should be," the mother said. "He is a predator. Everything about him is a predator, but they are not afraid." She paused. "I think they know. I think children always know." "Know what?" The mother's light steadied into amber. "Who is safe?" In the nursery, Priya Sharma lay in a medical cot that the human doctors had set up beside the larval pools. Her right arm was in a regenerative cast, the bone mending through accelerated healing technology that itched constantly. Her back was bandaged where the acid burns had eaten through her armor and into her skin. She was in pain, but the medication kept it manageable, and she refused to be moved to the Florence because she had promised Sothal she would come back. Sothal was with her constantly. She had appointed herself Priya's caretaker, and she performed this role with a fierce dedication that surprised the other Valeth, who knew Sothal as a quiet and reserved researcher. She brought Priya food, human rations supplemented with Valeth preparations that were surprisingly good, a light and clean with a flavor like the ocean. She adjusted the humidity in Priya's section of the nursery so it was comfortable for human lungs. She sat beside the cot and talked about her research, about the colony, about her homeworld, about anything except the battle. And she glowed. Not the formal, controlled bioluminescence of a Valeth diplomat or the reflexive emotional responses that the species was known for. This was something different, a steady, deliberate light that Sothal chose to emit, a conscious decision to illuminate the space around Priya with warmth. One evening, when the colony was quiet and the larvae were drifting in their pools, and the only sound was the gentle hum of water filters, Priya looked at Sothal and said, "What does that color mean?" "The amber one. I see it everywhere now." Sothal was quiet for a moment. Her glow shifted, as if she was thinking about how to explain something in a language that did not have the right words. "We did not have this color before you came," she said. "It is new. My people have been trying to name it. Colony Master Ioleth has proposed a word, and I think it will be accepted. The word is Vashran." "Vashran," Priya repeated. The word was soft in her mouth, like a whisper. "It means the light of those who came. It is the feeling of being saved by someone who had no reason to save you. The feeling of kindness that is so unexpected and so complete that your body does not know how to express it with any existing color, so it creates a new one." Priya stared at her. "You made a new emotion because of us?" "We made a new word for an emotion that already existed, but we had never felt. We had never needed it. And nobody had ever come for us before." Priya's eyes were wet. She blinked and looked away, toward the larval pools where 3,000 small lives glowed in the warm water, alive because of what had happened in orbit and in the corridors above. "Well," she said, her voice rough, "now you have it. Now we have it." Sothal reached out and took Priya's uninjured hand. Her fingers were cool and thin, and where they touched Priya's skin, they left a faint trace of amber light, like a mark that said, You are the reason this word exists. 2 weeks after the battle, the Galactic Concord convened a special session. The Senate chamber on Valros Prime was full. Not just full, overflowing. Every species had sent representatives, and the gallery was packed with journalists, historians, military analysts, and ordinary citizens who had traveled from across the galaxy to be present. The battle at Tyra 4 was the only thing anyone had talked about for 2 weeks. The sensor recordings from the Concorde observation flotilla had been broadcast on every news network, and the galaxy had watched them with a mixture of awe, disbelief, and something uncomfortable that many species were struggling to name. It looked a lot like shame. Speaker Tarun called the session to order. His rumbling voice echoed through the vast chamber, and the delegates fell silent. The first speaker was Siluri, the Valith ambassador. She walked to the central podium the same way she had walked there weeks ago. Slowly, carefully, her old body laboring under the heavy gravity of the chamber. But she was not the same. Her bioluminescence was different. Where before she had been dark with grief, now she burned with a steady, fierce amber that illuminated the podium and the floor around it like a small sun. She reached the podium and placed her hands on its surface. She looked out at the thousands of faces watching her, and she began to speak. 3 weeks ago, I stood at this podium and wept. I wept because my people were going to die, and no one in this chamber was willing to help them. I wept because every treaty, every promise, every declaration of unity and mutual protection that this body has ever made turned out to be nothing more than words. Her voice was steady. It did not crack. It burned. Today, I am going to show you something. I am going to show you what happened while you were protecting yourselves. She activated the chamber's holographic display, and the sensor recordings began to play. The delegates watched the human fleet arrive at Tyra 4. They watched the Phalanx formation deploy. They watched the first wave of 200 million bioships crash against the destroyer screen and be destroyed. They watched the second wave breach the line. They watched the Kursk ram a hive vessel and keep firing from its wreckage. They watched fighters dive into the swarm and come out the other side trailing debris. They watched Marines stand in corridors and fight with their bodies when their weapons failed. They watched the Indomitable detonate its reactor. They heard the crew singing. The chamber was silent. Thousands of delegates, tens of thousands of observers, and not one of them made a sound. Siluri let the recordings play. She showed the 7th Fleet's arrival, the destruction of the hive vessels, the swarm's retreat. She showed the aftermath, the human ships battered and broken, the crews exhausted, the medical teams treating Valith wounded with improvised techniques. She showed Sergeant Kowalski sitting on the floor, while Valith children climbed on him. She showed a human combat engineer, her arm in a cast and her back bandaged with burns, being held by a Valith researcher in a corridor lit with amber light. When the recordings finished, Siluri turned off the display. The chamber was so quiet that the atmospheric processors sounded like thunder. You all heard the signal, Siluri said. Every species in this chamber received our distress call. You all had fleets. You all had weapons. You all had the ability to help. And you all chose to protect yourselves. She let the words hang in the air. The humans had the same choice. They could have done nothing the way you did. They could have sent condolences and pulled their ships back to their own territory and let us die. That would have been the rational decision, the strategic decision, the safe decision. Her amber glow intensified. Instead, they sent 200 ships to fight an extinction-class hazard for a species they barely knew. They lost 17 ships. They lost 1,412 people. Fathers and mothers and sons and daughters. They burned across the galaxy and stood in the dark and bled for us. And when I asked their ambassador why, she said it was because we asked for help. She looked out at the Senate. Her eyes, dark and liquid and old, moved across the faces of 4,000 species. I want every person in this chamber to sit with that. I want you to think about what it means. I want you to ask yourself whether your species would have done the same. And then I want you to ask yourself what this Concord is for if it cannot protect the people it promised to protect. She stepped back from the podium. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. The silence lasted for nearly a full minute. Then from the upper tiers a sound began. It was quiet at first, a rhythmic pounding, the universal sound of approval that many species had adopted from the humans themselves. Applause. It started with the smaller delegations, the species with little political power, the ones who had wanted to help but lacked the ships. It spread. It grew. Within 30 seconds. Yet the entire upper gallery was applauding. Within a minute, the lower tiers joined. Within 2 minutes, the Senate chamber shook with the sound of 4,000 species acknowledging something they could not deny. The humans had done what they would not. Ambassador Kira Osei was asked to speak. She walked to the podium with the same quiet, unremarkable stride that characterized everything she did. She wore the same black suit. She carried no notes. She stood at the podium where Siluri had wept and Siluri had burned, and she looked out at the galaxy's representatives with an expression that was calm and open and completely without arrogance. "Thank you, Ambassador Siluri," she said, "and thank you to the delegates for this opportunity to speak." She paused. She seemed to be choosing her words carefully, one not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted them to be exact. "I have heard many theories over the past 2 weeks about why humanity responded to the Valeth distress signal. I have heard that it was a strategic move to gain political influence. I have heard that it was a military exercise to test our weapons against a new enemy. I have heard that it was an act of aggression designed to intimidate other species. I have heard many things." She shook her head slightly. "None of them are true. The truth is much simpler than that, and I think that is why so many people have trouble believing it." She looked at the Senate. "We came because someone was in trouble and we could help. That is the whole reason. That is the only reason. That we did not come to Tyra 4 to prove a point, or to gain an advantage, or to show the galaxy what we could do. We came because 11,000 people were going to die, and we could not live with ourselves if we let that happen." She paused again. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Not anger, not sadness, something more fundamental, something that sounded like belief. "Where we come from, there is a very old idea. It is so old that we do not know who first said it. The idea is simple. When someone needs help, you help. You do not ask what they can give you. You do not calculate the cost. You do not weigh the strategic implications. You help, because that is what you do. That is what it means to be the kind of people we want to be." She let the words settle. "I am not here to criticize this body. I am not here to shame anyone. Every species has the right to protect itself, and fear is not a crime. But I will say this. The next time someone sends a signal, I hope more of us answer it. Because the galaxy is very large and very dark, and the only thing that makes it bearable is the knowledge that when the dark comes, you are not alone." She stepped back. "If anyone else sends a signal, we will answer that one too." She walked back to her seat. The chamber erupted again. Applause, this time mixed with voices, delegates calling out statements of support, proposals, questions. The political earthquake that had been building since the battle finally broke. In the weeks that followed, the galaxy changed. 7 species formally requested military alliances with humanity. 12 more proposed joint defense initiatives. Where the Conquered established a new rapid response protocol modeled directly on the human fleet's mobilization procedures, designed to ensure that no distress signal would go unanswered again. The phrase "who answered the signal" became a galactic idiom. It was used in political debates, in diplomatic negotiations, in conversations between ordinary people on thousands of worlds. It meant what it sounded like. When things were hard, when the stakes were high, when the cost was real, who showed up? It became a measure of character, of integrity, of the difference between promises and actions. The real Shari delegate who had argued against intervention quietly resigned from the Senate. The Torvan Dominion donated a fleet of transport ships to the Valeth for evacuating their young in future emergencies. The Morthani, whose representative had given a beautiful speech that offered nothing, established a foundation to fund the construction of defensive infrastructure for vulnerable colonies. They named it the Vasic Foundation, after the captain of the Indomitable. On Tyra 4, the colony was rebuilt. It was stronger now, not just because of the human-built fortifications, but because of what the Valeth who lived there had experienced. They were still a gentle species. They still glowed with soft light and moved through their curved corridors with the grace of creatures born in water. But there was something different about them now. A steadiness, a confidence, the knowledge that they had been in the dark and someone had come for them. The UNSC established a memorial in orbit above Tyra 4. It was a simple thing, a black obelisk, polished smooth, with names carved into its surface. 1,412 names. Every human who had died in the Battle of Tyra 4. The obelisk was placed in a stable orbit that would last for thousands of years, turning slowly in the darkness above the moon it had helped to save. The Valith added their own memorial. At the base of the obelisk, anchored to its surface with molecular bonding, they planted a garden of bioluminescent coral from their homeworld. The coral grew slowly, spreading across the obelisk's surface in patterns of blue and gold and amber, pulsing with gentle light that was visible from the surface of the moon below. Passing ships could see it from light seconds away. A black stone wrapped in living light, turning in the dark. The names of the dead, embraced by the gratitude of the living. Priya Sharma's arm healed. The burns on her back scarred because some wounds went too deep for even human regenerative medicine, and she carried those scars for the rest of her life. She did not mind. They were proof of something. She stayed on Tyra 4 for 6 months, overseeing the colony's reconstruction and the installation of permanent defenses. Sothal was with her every day. They worked together, ate together, talked for hours about everything and nothing, about Priya's childhood on Mars, about Sothal's research into the ancient ruins, about the differences between their species and the ways those differences did not matter. When Priya finally received orders to return to Earth, Sothal walked with her to the landing pad. The shuttle was waiting, its engines humming in the cold air. Priya turned to face her. So Sothal's light was cycling through colors that Priya had learned to read over 6 months. Blues of fondness, golds of warmth, and that deep, steady amber of Vashran that never quite went away. "I'll come back," Priya said. "I know you will. Your people really adopted me, didn't they? The Colony Council actually sent me a formal notification." Sothal's light flickered with amusement. A quick sparkle of silver that was the Valith equivalent of a laugh. "I told you, it was not optional." Priya smiled. She reached out and took Sothal's hand, and the two of them stood there for a moment, a human and a Valith, on a small moon at the edge of nowhere, connected by something that had no name in either of their languages but was real and strong and good. "Thank you," Sothal said, "for everything." "Thank you," Priya said, sitting for the light. She squeezed Sothal's hand once, then turned and walked to the shuttle. She did not look back because she knew she would see Sothal standing there, glowing amber, and she knew that if she looked back, she might not leave. The shuttle lifted off. Tyra 4 fell away beneath it, the colony shrinking to a cluster of lights on a dark surface. Above, the memorial obelisk turned in its orbit, its coral garden pulsing with gentle fire. Priya watched it from the shuttle's window until it disappeared into the stars. 1 year later, Sothal stood before a class of young Valith on the colony's education level. They were old enough to have been larvae during the battle, now growing into their adolescent forms, long-limbed and curious and full of questions. They sat in a semicircle around her, their bioluminescence a riot of colors that shifted with every thought and feeling. One of them, a girl with unusually bright markings, raised her hand. "Researcher Sothal, what are humans like?" The class went quiet. Every young Valith turned to look at Sothal with wide, dark eyes. They had all grown up in the shadow of the battle. They had all been told the story, but they wanted to hear it from someone who knew. Sothal looked at them. She thought about Priya. She thought about Kowalski sitting on the floor while children climbed on him. She thought about the crew of the Indomitable singing as their ship died. She thought about Admiral Vasquez saying, "Not on my watch," and Ambassador Osei saying, "That's the whole reason," and a young Marine named Rivera standing alone in a corridor with nothing but a rifle and the absolute refusal to let anything past him. She thought about a message sent across the galaxy in broken Valith that said, "Hold on, we're coming. Nobody dies today." Her light shifted. It moved through colors, blue for memory, gold for warmth, silver for wonder. and then it settled into that deep, steady amber that had become the most important color her species had ever produced. They come from a world that tried to kill them every day of their existence, she said. Their planet has earthquakes that split the ground open. It has storms that flatten forests. It has oceans that swallow ships and mountains that freeze the air in your lungs. Every living thing on their world is either trying to eat them or trying to poison them, and some of them are trying to do both at the same time. The children stared at her, their lights dimmed with instinctive fear. And instead of becoming cruel, Sothal continued, they became kind. Instead of learning only how to fight, they learned how to protect. Instead of closing themselves off from the universe, they reached out and looked for others who needed them. Her light pulsed, slow and warm, like a heartbeat. They are loud. They are strange. They take up too much space in our corridors, and they eat things that would make you sick, and they express emotions by leaking water from their eyes, which is alarming the first time you see it. They break everything they touch because their hands are too strong for our world. She paused. The children were leaning forward, their lights cycling with fascination. But when the dark came for us, when something older and hungrier and more terrible than anything we had ever known came to eat our world and everyone on it, they crossed the galaxy. They came with 200 ships. They stood between us and the swarm, and they said no. She let the word hang in the air. They lost ships. They lost people. They bled and burned and died for us, and they had never even met us. They had no reason to come except that we asked for help. And when it was over, when the swarm was gone, and the dark had retreated, they stayed. They healed our wounded. They rebuilt our home. They sat on our floors and let our children climb on them. And they were so gentle with us that you would never believe they were the most dangerous species in the galaxy. She looked at the girl who had asked the question. Her light was the steadiest amber the class had ever seen. That is what humans are like. The classroom was silent. 20 young Valeth sat in a semicircle, their bioluminescence cycling through colors they did not fully understand yet, feelings they were too young to name. But among the shifting blues and golds and silvers, amber was appearing. One by one, the children began to glow with a color their grandparents had never known, a color that had been born in the darkest moment of their colony's history and had become the brightest light in their vocabulary. Vashrin, the light of those who came. Outside the classroom, beyond the colony walls, beyond the thin atmosphere of Tyra 4, the memorial obelisk turned in its orbit. 1,412 names, carved in black stone, wrapped in living coral that glowed with the light of a grateful species. And beyond the obelisk, beyond the system, beyond the vast and empty distances of the ashful expanse, the galaxy turned. Billions of stars, trillions of worlds, countless species going about their lives, making their choices, deciding every day who they were and who they wanted to be. The signal had been sent, the signal had been answered, and the galaxy would remember.